Hey, this is Michael Lindsay. I'm out here in Milestone today for my first ride on the 2020 Husqvarna FC450. Now, it hasn't been that long since I've been on one of the Husqvarna 450s, considering we did the Rockstar Edition a couple months ago. You can check out my video by hitting the link in the description on that, and I also have a tech brief on that bike, because we're gonna go ahead and talk about the changes from the Rockstar Edition onto our full 2020 production bike. So those changes are a little bit larger than I thought they would probably go forward with. Most notable is this is the first FC450 that's really gone this much attention when it comes to suspension. Talking to the crew, they said that all the settings and the actual valving inside the fork and shock have really been precisely set up for the Husqvarna. Where normally they get a KTM setting and get to tweak on a little bit, they really tried to put in a little bit extra effort into designing it around this package. So why does it actually need to be different? Everything from the way this bike delivers power to the carbon composite subframe, the way that makes everything flex and feel, changes the characteristic enough of the bike that it could take its own setup, which they've gone ahead with. Now, it's kind of interesting because from a first impression standpoint, they've dropped the rear shock spring and they've also dropped the stock air pressure setting. They basically dropped the spring rates front and rear, which to me would give the bike more of a supple, soft feeling, which at low speed it does, but they've actually ramped up the valving on each end to still give it a really aggressive character, something that is really race ready, something that can be ridden on that aggressive level. But for the overall characteristic, I feel like it really goes well with the chassis on this bike, which tends to flex a little bit more than the KTM. The softer spring rates definitely helps it settle a little bit more. But even with that, the setting changes I made today were related to settling a little bit from the valving side. I was really stoked on that spring rate change because I am a little bit on the lighter side. So the bike balance was fairly easy to acquire for me. But still from there, I slowed down the rebound 3 clicks front and rear just to get it to settle down a little bit more into the rut and stay a little bit lower in the stroke. And that also opened up the high speed a little bit to squat it under acceleration. Now, the power itself is pretty mellow. They did an ECU change this year, and there's also an optional airbox lid that is perforated for more airflow. I actually got the opportunity to test with KTM and Husqvarna earlier this year over this ECU test. And on the KTM, it's a much bigger difference. It's a lot sharper response. It's a lot more aggressive. On the Husqvarna, they've still kept a very mellow style power band. In the MAP 1 or 2 on the stock airbox lid, it's still a very slow, easy roll on. There's a lot of torque there, but it builds at a very mellow RPM and makes it an extremely easy bike to ride. The perforated lid is definitely my preferred preference on this bike. It gives it a little bit of a sharper response, more of a connected feel to the wrist, which I prefer for making little motions in and out of the corner, being able to use the throttle to manipulate the bike, pop it and settle it into ruts and things like that. But it's still a fairly mellow power build. It's a small change on that airbox lid for the Husky, where I felt like on the KTM it was a larger change. Looking at the airbox lids, it makes sense to me. The KTM's got a lot larger diamond cut holes in the side of the box, where the Husky has it right on the top of the lid in these small little slits. Like I said, it's a smaller change, but it still gives you basically 4 different power characteristics on this bike. You've got MAP 1, which is very mellow, MAP 2, which has a harder, more fast RPM build, to a very minor extent though, how those two feel in difference. And then the airbox lid sets you into something that has more initial response and a little bit quicker RPM build, and then you can use MAP 1 or 2 on that to decide. So realistically, it's kind of like the bike almost has 4 mapping options. Coming from the Rockstar Edition, I definitely like these changes to the production 2020 bike. If you're 170 and below on weight, I think you'll prefer the spring rate and the base air change. I do like the motor change. So like I said, I really like the airbox lid and the mapping change. It's a little bit of a sharper, more connected feel of hand, but they didn't make the Husky too much to handle still. It still has a very easy to ride character, very broad power band. They also made a small gearing change, which I think on most tighter to mid-level tracks will make second to third to fourth a much more usable gap. You're not stretching them out so far that it feels like you're never getting through the gearbox on the bike. About the only thing I prefer from the Rockstar Edition is the Power Parts triple clamps, which for me would be an immediate upgrade to this. I felt like there was a little bit loss of initial comfort on the fork that I thought that those clamps brought to the table. Really, when it comes to complaints, there's not much that stands out on the Husky for me outside of really the biggest one I still complain about year over year is the seat cover and seat base. It's pretty abusive. It takes a little bit to get used to. But beyond that, everything else is nitpicking. I could play with the forks for a little bit more mid-stroke comfort. I also feel like the power doesn't naturally suit me as well as some other bikes. I definitely like a bike that has a really connected feel, a lot more initial response. Not something that rips your arms off, but just something to me that reacts a little bit quicker to my inputs. And the Husky is kind of the exact opposite power of that for me. There's definitely people that are gonna like this style power because it is a really easy to use 450, but still that it has a good amount of torque and horsepower. It's not easy to ride because it's down on power. It has plenty of it. It's just the way they've spread it out. And it just, like I said, kind of misses my personal preference by a little bit there. We're just getting ready to jump into shootout season this next week. This bike will be really interesting because, like I said, in pass, it doesn't always peak out each day to day for riders, but it does really well over a wide range of terrains. And I think that's its biggest strength and continuing to be its strength into 2020.